Alright, so I just got finished watching the Grounded 2 documentary on the making of The Last of Us Part 2. Of course, people were really excited for this, and I knew that in watching this documentary, we would get a bunch of different things revealed that we didn't know before, and so I kind of wanted to review it with you, but also at the very end, they revealed a lot about the future of The Last of Us, and I didn't think they would do that, and so I really want to cover that as well. So this video is probably going to be a little bit longer. I don't know how long. I'm going to go through the notes of what I had in watching the show and then cover the future of The Last of Us at the end, so you can skip around to see whatever you want, but I kind of just wanted to cover this with you guys and have a video that had all of my thoughts, and so hopefully you enjoyed this thing. With that being said, let's dive into this. So first off, I just want to say the documentary was super well done. The first Grounded documentary they made on the first game was really great and really fun as a fan to watch. And to watch this second one, it was incredible. I found myself getting weirdly emotional in a lot of it. And I just want to say that I think they did a great job. This documentary is really well done. It's worth checking out if you're a fan. Even if you're not, and you're just curious about developing content like this, whether it's gaming or movies or your own content, it's really interesting to watch. There's a lot to learn. But let's just go from the beginning to the end of my notes in watching this thing. And so, firstly, one tidbit that we found out is that originally The Last of Us Part 2 was going to start with Joel's death immediately. That it was going to open with Ellie walking kind of down the hallway, running into Tommy, freaking out, being like, "Tommy, what's going on?" And Tommy was going to be distraught. And then you would walk into the room to see what happened to Joel. And then it would cut to black and you would do a flashback. And I just thought that was really interesting, that I had never heard that before. And eventually we know it changed to where you were able to witness Joel's death. And they kind of talked about that a little bit later on. And so we might cover that in a later part of this video. But I thought that was really interesting, how different that would have been for you to start the game seeing Joel dead. I'm glad they changed it. I think it works better not having that, but that would have been I don't think there would have been enough breath for you to be able to feel the emotions you should have felt, because then you would have had to flash back and it would have felt like, what did I just see? And so I think it's a really interesting concept, but I am glad that they changed it, but that's really interesting. And then the next thing that stood out was just the reaction to Joel's death. So they pretty much kick off this documentary by them telling a lot of the heads of staff, doing the presentation of the story, and they're like, "Hey, for the first time ever, Naughty Dog, we actually have like the full story from A to B. We know things are going to change throughout developing this, but the story is essentially locked," and they went through it. And they pretty much start off by telling everybody that Joel's going to die, and you can just watch the faces of people in the studio be like, I don't know what we're doing. This feels like a big mistake, and a lot of the things that fans felt. And so that was really interesting to watch, and to watch Neil know, like, guys, we're just getting started. Like, you see all these people freaking out, he's like, this is just the beginning. It's only gonna get more intense and worse. And I thought that that was really cool to see. And a little line that was in here was essentially that in making part 2, they were showing to the fans that this isn't a sequel, because a lot of people were like, this game's unsequelable, that you can't make a second Last of Us, and they were like, that's kind of silly. It ends in a way that we intended there to be a sequel, because people were like, it's a perfect game. They're like, it's not perfect. It ends on such ambiguity that we were going to always make a second one. But then they thought of the part 2 title, because they're like, this is part 2 of one entire story, that the first game is just the first part of this multifaceted story that is about Ellie. And I thought that was really interesting, because there's been lots of speculation as to what part 3 will be and what it will include. And them saying that means that whatever part 3 is, it's going to be at its core a story about Ellie, and probably the conclusion to whatever her story is. And so that was just encouraging to me, because some fans have said that it could be like most of the game is completely unrelated characters, and then at the end Ellie shows up, and I was like, that feels weird. And apparently to the studio it seems like that would feel weird for them as well, and so that was encouraging to hear. And then another tidbit in these early conversations was that originally in the story, Ellie was going to kill Abby. That was kind of the ending of the game, is you would essentially watch Ellie become so enlarged in rage that she wouldn't be able to control herself, and at the end would have killed Abby and would have essentially become a villain. And I am glad that they backed away from that, because one, they talked about how doing that would have left Ellie feeling incredibly empty. I think it would have left her in a similar situation to Abby, where after killing Abby, she would have felt like that didn't do anything. And that was kind of Abby's whole story of like, I killed this guy, I thought it would bring me relief, all it's done is make things worse. And so I am glad that they backed off of that and that they made a good move. But it is interesting because a lot of fans were like, they should have just killed Abby. And it's interesting to know that originally that was the case. And they thought, I think a better direction is for her to actually let go and to keep that part of her humanity. Twitch people were like, oh, she killed so many people, why would she care? And it's like, it's different. That she finally was grasping the thing that she wanted, that she thought would bring her freedom, and realized in it, like, this is going to destroy me. And we watched it destroy Abby. And so I am thankful that they backed away from that, but that was really interesting. And another interesting tidbit in this whole Joel death thing and them revealing some of these things is that Troy Baker always thought Joel needed to die. That was really interesting, that apparently even in the first game, he was like, this game should end with Joel dying, that Joel's done too much stuff to just get away scot-free in the real world, that like something needs to happen. And Neil was like, no, we're not going to kill him. And he was really pushing to be like, Joel needs to die. And I felt the same thing too. When I played the first game, I was like, if they make a sequel, there is no way, as much as I love Joel, that he's making it through. He's making it through that one. He's going to die. His time is probably coming because of what he did with Ellie, that somebody is going to show up and kill him. I always felt that from the very beginning. And so it was interesting that Troy felt the same way, because we know stories like Mark Hamill, who like very clearly didn't seem to agree with the direction that the sequels for Star Wars took him in. And it's interesting that Troy really did. But interestingly enough, Neil talks about how because Troy was so pro Joel's death, essentially, that when he thought that he was going to tell Troy, like, hey, we are going to kill Joel in part 2, that he thought Troy would be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But Joel, that's funny that I would call him that. Troy actually took it really hard initially, and Neil was kind of walking him through the story, and he essentially tells him at one point, like, hey, I just need you to stop. I need to just like take a minute, because to him it felt like, oh, like I've been talking about this thing, but it's different when it actually happens. And he describes it like it felt like somebody I knew died, and I just needed to like breathe for a second, needed Neil to stop talking. And so that's really interesting, just how attached to Joel Troy actually is. And then jumping forward, they moved into talking about the open world concept for the game that they initially had. And I've always thought to myself that that sounded horrible when I've heard that originally this game was going to be open world, because of the like Fallout 4 stuff and all the different things where you're like, I just don't think a very heavily narrative driven game like The Last of Us will do justice in an open world. Even for something like Red Dead 2, like most people I know don't actually finish the story, which is a shame because of the open world. And so I'm glad that they steered away from that. And in seeing it too, it just didn't work. Like narratively, it didn't make sense when you were riding your horse. Like you can't just have your horse die and then go find another horse. We're in the apocalypse. And so I think it was really smart for them to move away from it, especially because a lot of people's biggest complaint in the game is that open world portion of Seattle where people didn't really like it. That when you go to a Naughty Dog game, you actually kind of want that linear experience, and you want the feeling of I could go everywhere without actually being able to go everywhere. And so I think that was a really smart idea. But yeah, seeing the open world concept instead of just hearing about it, it's like, yeah, this doesn't work. I'm really glad they moved away from that. I hope they don't move toward it in the future, but you never know. If they do, it will be because it works, and they only dropped it because they knew it didn't. So I guess there's some comfort in that. And this documentary really dives into a lot of background stuff that, I don't know, I wasn't always fully aware of as a fan. And they dive really specifically into this weird, angry reaction people had to when the first trailers and clips from The Last of Us Part 2 were being released, of people online being super angry about violence against women and being like, did any woman even work on this game? And it's really ironic because the co-writer Haley is sitting there being like, I co-wrote it. I literally have worked on this entire story. And it's just funny. It was a funny glimpse onto the online community and how people get so enraged about stuff and like just they just have no idea what they're talking about. They throw their arms up in the air and are just like furious. And then the irony of the amount of women who worked on this game and how they're like, this is not a game promoting violence against women. Like, what a weird take on this game and what we're doing. It just happens that our characters of this game are female protagonists, and there's no way to play a video game in the apocalypse in the Last of Us world without violence happening. And so it was a really interesting just little segment to see, like, sometimes when you're on the inside and seeing how people react to the thing you're making, being like, you guys have no clue what you're talking about. I just can't imagine how frustrating that is as somebody who would have been working on this game. And again, there's way more controversial things that happen, but even in something small like that, and how much that would just like bother you and frustrate you, I can't imagine that's an easy weight to hold. And you see it in Haley when she talks about this, she's like super furious about it, and it's kind of comical and kind of funny, but it's super weird. The internet's a weird place, man. And then they, of course, show us the filming of Joel's death scene, and I was surprised how emotional this was, even to watch secondhand, that the actors were super emotional in it. And like Laura Bailey starts crying and like couldn't control it because she watched essentially how Ashley Johnson was acting and reacting to Joel's death, and it just like broke her. And even for me, in watching the documentary, I've played through the scene a few times. It usually gets me like a little bit choked up, but I've seen it enough that I'm used to seeing it. And to rewatch it through the actors playing it, I felt the emotions again, just seeing how incredible of a job Laura Bailey and Ashley Johnson and Troy Baker do in that scene, in their performances, that I don't know if it's something in your brain that tells you that you're not watching acting or what, but it was surprisingly emotional, not just for me rewatching it like this, but for the actors as well. And I just think that's really cool to see, that you often don't get glimpses into that and how actors are reacting, because you don't know if they say cut and then they're all just laughing, hanging around. But that was not the case for that scene. And even the fear they had of having to reshoot it, and Troy talks about that specifically, about how hard the Sarah scene was and how they had to refilm it so many times and eventually go back even again to film it, and how scared he was that for this scene this would happen, and paranoid he was, and how much everybody worked to make sure that didn't happen because they knew how emotional that scene would be. It was just really interesting to watch as a fan, and I found it fascinating. Then they really dive into crunch, and they take a good glimpse at how they were trying to prevent it, and we're like, we're going to make a schedule to make sure nobody crunches. And later they say that that doesn't actually help anything. All that does is make you make a really big game. It doesn't actually help crunch. And they were trying to encourage people to pace themselves. But you feel this tension always of setting a deadline and not being able to hit it. And then also being the studio that they are, being like, we're not going to ship like a Golem. Like if we ship a game, it's because it's going to be ready and polished, and it's going to be not just passable, but the best of the best. That if we have a crawling mechanic, it's the best crawling mechanic you've seen, etc., etc. And to see how that fueled with the deadlines, them doing crunch and people justifying it, being like, yeah, I want to stay late because I want this thing to be the best thing it can be. And that people, when they're passionate about something like this, and when they're passionate about their art, it's not about keeping your job. It's about wanting to produce the best thing you can and feeling the overwhelmingness of like, we're going to miss a deadline and I need to do my part. And there was a really funny line towards the end of them showing this crunch and what it did to people, and even them bringing in these dinners to like feed people and thinking it was a nice thing, but later they think it was actually a negative thing that encouraged people to stay and crunch. But one of the developers says that he is very pro making the game small again, that making games this big is going to make crunch. And he's like, why do we need games that are this huge and this long? Why can't we make a smaller experience like Last of Us Part 1, have it be really polished and well done, and let's make those kinds of games? And he said, I'm very pro make the small game again. And I just thought that was an interesting line. It made me think, are they going to make smaller games moving forward? Will they make a game as big as Part 2? I can't imagine them ever making a game longer than Part 2 was, given watching the reactions they had to the crunch and the thoughts they had. But you never know, they just might find a healthier way to do it. But I thought it was really bold of Naughty Dog and great for them to put that in. It doesn't make your company look good, but everybody knows it's happening, and I think it's great to own that and say, hey, this is what it was actually like to work on it. And then, of course, you have the leaks, and essentially this starts to happen when the outbreak of a certain virus started to happen, and they were like, oh shoot, like we were really protective of leaks, and we kind of had just one server in the room. Everybody's emails were on their computers. In the thing, you couldn't take a computer home, and Naughty Dog was super tight on leaks. And then because of what was happening in the world, people had to work from home, whatever, and they had to like really quickly throw together, and it was really cool to see them throwing in like early models of the PS5 into suitcases so they could take home and work on stuff. And just the panic that they had of being like, we need to make this work, we don't have a lot of time, which eventually led to leaks getting out because the system they had built was starting to fall apart. And you begin to dive into seeing just the hatred that someone was able to steal something from inside. They were able to essentially find a back door and infiltrate the hard drives of Naughty Dog and download an insane amount of content. And you just see the hatred roll in and the amount of damage it caused to real life people. I think people often forget when they get furious at this stuff that there are real people with real lives that their anger is being directed at. And just the sickening stuff of like all the death threats. There's one interview particularly where they talk with Laura Bailey and she kind of dives into all the stuff that was coming her way. And you see some of the messages of people saying that they're going to kill her and they're going to find her. And she had to report some of them to the police that were like very graphic and more detailed. That wasn't just like, I'm going to kill you, but like more intense. And then on top of that, people even threatening, because she, during the filming of the game, was pregnant, had given birth to a son, people attacking her son, saying they were going to show up at her house and kill her kid in front of, like, just like horrible stuff that is really sickening. I don't know. Even in watching this, it made me, again, because I've been feeling this conviction for a bit of not wanting to cover really any leaks. So like what happened with Insomniac, I initially made a video and then afterward was like, I think this is actually kind of messed up. I don't know if I like this. And now, especially in watching this and watching what happens to people and how devastating it is to have something and to think you're going to be able to like present it in the way that it needs to be presented for people to understand it and to have that ripped from you as a company. And then all of the like just honestly crazy people online who do crazy stuff. Like, I don't care if you don't like The Last of Us Part 2, but if you're one of the people who's like sending death threats to real life people because of a fictional world, like I just want to be like, what's wrong with you? And the world just has crazy people in it who do crazy stuff. And I think it was just sickening to watch that happened to real life people. And I can't fully wrap my brain around it, but it was honestly disturbing to watch what occurred because of those leaks. And then in all this, Troy has a really interesting line where, because Neil calls him and sees people reacting to Joel's death and is like, Troy, I'm really sorry. I think I failed you. I don't know if we did the right thing in how we killed Joel. And Troy's like, listen, man, I don't know because I haven't played it. So people are upset, but I haven't played it in its context. So I don't know whether it is upsetting or not, and neither have these people. And then Troy, now in present day, is saying that there isn't a single thing, now that he's played the story, that he would ever change, and that Neil messaged him when the game released, essentially wanting to know what he thought, and Troy said, this game is incredible. It's one of my favorite stories of all time. You did an incredible job, blah, 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 blah. And Troy today says that when people come to him and are like, I don't like what they did to Joel, he always invites it and says, oh, interesting. So like, what would you have done differently? And I felt like this line was really profound from him. And he says, out of everybody who's ever told me a different version of this story, they still can't top what we originally had. And I have been trying to get people to tell me a better version of the story, and to this day they still can't. And I thought that was just really profound from Troy and really interesting. I feel the same way. I really liked the game. I understand that it doesn't work for everybody, but I'm in the same boat as Troy, and I'm like, that's a really profound thought, that if you have the guy who portrays this character feeling like it did his character justice, and that out of all of the fan theories and alternate stories he heard, that this is still the one he feels like is the most fitting and the one that this character needed, that I feel like we should honor that. Now, you can have your own opinion, but I'm like, it's just comforting to know that the guy who played it is like, yeah, this is the best version of the story I've heard, and I still haven't heard a better story to this day. I thought that was really interesting. And then to double in on kind of the revenge theme, eventually they figure out who the leaker was who leaked all the stuff, and just to see the difference in posture Neil has when they find out it's a fan, and that because the game got delayed, the fan was holding on to all this stuff, wasn't going to leak it, and just thought it was cool to see. But then hearing the game got delayed because of the virus that was going around, that they thought they could like force Naughty Dog's hand. It was like, oh, I'm just going to release a bunch of stuff so that Naughty Dog just has to release this game, which is short-sighted because the game wasn't done. If they could release it, they would release it. And this person, though, really sounded like they didn't think through this like deep act of maliciousness, that it was more like there was a thing I wanted that I was excited about that then I thought I could put pressure on to like release the thing I was excited about. And to see Neil be like, I needed to learn the lesson from my own game of like, we could pursue, because he's like, initially I just want to pursue this and like I want to pin this person up against the wall and like every way that we can get them and like have every consequence coming for them, let's do it. And then when he hears the story and finds out who he is, he's like, you know what, if anybody can learn a lesson from this game and what the story is supposed to mean, it should be me, and I just need to let it go. And to see that, I thought was really interesting and cool and profound about how inside of this game about revenge and about essentially the cycle of violence, to see its own creator have to essentially choose to not pursue the cycle of violence in his own way and to not get his due justice, I thought was really interesting and made me weirdly emotional to even see him. That was really cool. And then they kind of move past the crunch, and of course they begin, once the game releases, essentially winning everything. That all of the reviews are stellar, that people love the game once they've played through the story, that it wins all of these awards, I think more than 300 Game of the Year awards. And just the satisfaction you feel, or must have felt, in the turmoil of what Neil calls like literally the worst period of his life, and being like, wow, I've screwed this entire franchise, to then seeing people who actually get to play the game love the game. And of course not everybody does, but for the most part, the majority of people do like the game a lot and think it's a masterpiece. And just to see that was really cool, and to see all that work that they did get well rewarded was awesome. And then we kind of enter into the post Last of Us 2 stuff and what they learned. And so they really address the crunch and how Naughty Dog is now a company that just has decided we don't do crunch anymore, that there's no exceptions, crunch is done. And they tried to figure out what crunch was, and it's hard to describe, where it's like, it's not just a matter of overworking hours, it's a feeling people have of being burnt out, because you can be working within your hours and still feel crunch. And so they were like, okay, let's just make a system where if you feel like there is crunch happening or you feel overwhelmed, that you can just tell somebody and there's not a consequence. We'll be like, okay, how can we make this easier? How can we give you the breaks you need? How can we help you? And their goal now is that no one at Naughty Dog ever burns out. And even stuff like the dinners, like a thing that's a cool kind of bonding experience that I feel like is like, oh, it's too bad we can't do that. But they decided, you know what, no more dinners where we're buying dinner for everybody, because it encourages people to stay and encourages people to do this crunch. Let's just get rid of that. And even people at the studio saying like, hey, Naughty Dog now feels like a completely different studio than when we were making The Last of Us Part 2. That stuff's really cool to hear. It's cool to see them be able to grow, to take the criticism, to actually do it and not just be like, suck it up, this is work, people. For me, I was like, this is really awesome to see a company as big as this do this, because they could have just been like, whatever, you want to work at Naughty Dog, you work. And they didn't. And that they actually genuinely care about people, I think was really cool. But then the end of the documentary, the thing you've all been waiting for, the teases for Part 3, I was actually kind of shocked that they did this. But they essentially fully tease you now, like, yeah, Part 3 is coming. And one thing I was not expecting at all was that Neil talks about how, hey, I've written a full story for Tommy. That's kind of his own game. It's not a full separate game like a Part 3, but it's more like Lost Legacy. And it's a fully done story, and we were going to make a game, but then we didn't want to crunch people, and we were in the season of trying to rework crunch, and so we decided to pull back from it. But one day, it's going to see the light of day for sure, whether it is a game that we'll make, or whether it appears in a TV show of some way, or maybe even a film, this story is going to be seen. That was incredibly exciting. A lot of us, including myself, have been dying for that Tommy story of his essential, because he's teasing what it is. Everyone knows what it is. It's essentially him running through the story of part 2 with flashbacks of him and Joel in the early days. It's kind of like a quasi prequel to The Last of Us, and man, did he make some big promises. One, that this thing does exist for sure, that the story is actually fully done, and that they were going to make it but just hit pause on making it. The fact that he teases that this story is for sure going to see the light of day, I have strong feelings. I hope it's not in the show, and it seems like he really does tease that sometime between now or maybe after part 3 that they are going to do that Uncharted Lost Legacy kind of thing for Tommy, and that is insanely exciting. I couldn't believe that was in there, and so that got me pumped, but that wasn't the only thing. Then at the very end, he talks about part 3, and he's like, for the longest time, I was working on this story, and as you can see in part 1 and part 2, they're different stories, but there's like this thread throughout them that is like the love between Joel and Ellie and what love is, and then Abby and her dad experience that love and what losing that does to somebody. And he's like, and I couldn't think of a concept for part 3 though, where I was like, what's the through line that then in the third concluding installment that we could have that would put it all together? And then he says, I found it now, and I do think that there is still one more chapter in this story, and then the documentary ends. And so they essentially confirm that The Last of Us Part 3 is a thing. It's going to be getting made, that they have a story, and that it also is going to be the conclusion of this story of Joel and Ellie. That, like they said at the very beginning, it was called Part 2 because it's the continuation of Joel and Ellie's story, and that is what this is about. Part 3 is going to be the conclusion of Joel and Ellie's story, that is not done yet, that there's more to do, and that they have found the through line in the concept for the game, and that the story is working. And so that's incredibly exciting to hear that. Of course, we've heard the rumors that they have been working on part 3 for a long time. Neil essentially confirms that by saying that he's been working on the story for a long time, trying to think of a concept. And so that's incredible. Whether that Joel and Tommy game comes out before, oh man, I hope it does. Or whether we see that Joel and Tommy game as kind of the afterthought of the part 3, where you get like The Last of Us Adventures with Tommy or whatever. I don't know. But those reveals were huge for me and were incredibly exciting, and I can't wait to see where this franchise goes from here. But with that being said, I want to know what you guys think, so head down to the comment section down below. Let me know your thoughts. What stood out to you in this documentary? Did you have a chance to watch it? Did you enjoy it? What were some of the things that you found really interesting? How do you feel about a Joel and Tommy game? How do you feel about knowing that story actually fully does exist, and that they were going to make a game and have just hit pause and are for sure going to release that story either in the show or in a film or in a game? And what do you think about the tease for part 3? What do you think that final concluding thread line is? If the first game was about love and the second game was about loss and the loss of that love, what would the concluding game about, like the main theme? What do you think that concept would be? That would be the through line through Joel and Ellie's story. How do you think they'll wrap it up? Let me know in the comment section down below. Like, comment, subscribe, all that junk, and I will see you guys in the next one.